We got a bit of a timeline issue that we're going to talk about today. This is going to be one of those technical ones where we add up the names and dates and facts and figures and try to make the whole thing fit together and make it so that people who see it different don't have to fight about things. It's going to feel really good, cathartic even, I think. But to set up the timeline conundrum, first we got to do a lightning fast overview. Ready, set, go. The Bible starts with nothing but God on screen, and then God is like, hey, there should be stuff instead of not stuff. So we make stuff, but then sin and corruption enters into the world, and instead of God being like, I'm just going to wipe it out and start over, he's like, no, I'm going to redeem the thing. And eventually he picks a guy named Abram, whose name becomes Abraham, and he says, I'm going to redeem it through this family right here. Keep an eye on this family. Important things are going to happen. And the family's pretty up and down. They don't exactly nail everything, but they're interesting, if nothing else. And at the end of Genesis, they end up in Egypt on a pretty good run. But then at the beginning of the book of Exodus, we discovered that things have gone wrong in the meantime, and now they're slaves. God's got to get them out of slavery. So he raises up another guy named Moses under amazing circumstances. There's a bunch of miracles, and the descendants of Abraham, the people to whom the redemptive story are kind of hitched, they get out of there, they cross the Red Sea, but they don't immediately go to where God has promised them. Instead, they wander around in the desert and sort out a few of their personal issues. The whole generation that leaves Egypt, they die out in the desert, but the next generation that was born more or less out in the desert, they go and conquer a whole bunch of little tiny kingdoms and micro city-states, and they divide up the land between 12 tribes, representative of the descendants of Abraham once again, and they go through a period of time where they're sort of governed by judges, leaders who come along and rise up to solve crises and problems from time to time over a few centuries. Eventually, they're like, we don't want judges and prophets anymore like that. We want kings like everybody else. And the remaining prophets are like, are you sure? Because that doesn't always, are you positive? And they're like, we're positive. Okay, so Saul is the first king of the United Kingdom. This is a little bit before 1000 BC of the descendants of Abraham, but that kingdom doesn't stay together for more than a couple of generations. David is the next king, and then Solomon, his son, and then everything splits into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. Northern kingdom gets 10 tribes, southern kingdom gets 2 tribes. Northern kingdom is always a dumpster fire. Southern kingdom is sometimes a dumpster fire. Eventually, in 732 BC, the northern kingdom gets conquered by the Assyrians and scattered to the winds of history. Now we only have the 2 tribes of the southern kingdom, Benjamin and Judah, left, and they hold out all the way until 586 BC, until, as predicted by the prophets, most notably Jeremiah, the Babylonians come along under Nebuchadnezzar, and they conquer Jerusalem. They destroy the temple where God lives among his people and where the sacrificial system is carried out, and they are taken away into slavery in Babylon until the Babylonians get defeated by a new upstart group called the Persians and Cyrus the Great. This happens in 539 BC, so it's only 40-ish years that they live under the boot of the oppressive Babylonians. And now it's the Persians who have custody of the oppressed descendants of Abraham. Will they be better or worse than the Babylonians? Well, it turns out they're better. Cyrus the Great pretty much immediately is like, yeah, you guys can go back and rebuild Jerusalem. You should do that right now. Maybe even here's a little bit of money or whatever. And they go and do it. It's not easy, but over the course of about 20 years, and a whole bunch of bureaucratic drama, they get things rebuilt. All of this is accounted for in the book of Ezra, and they start doing sacrifices again. They dedicate a smaller temple, but it's still a temple, so that's pretty good. And then a couple generations later, there's a king who comes along named Xerxes. He's got a right-hand man who's a mean idiot who tries to kill all the Jews, but a secret Jew, Esther, is made queen, and she thwarts the efforts of the bad guy, Haman, who wants to kill all the Jews, and the Jews now enjoy maybe even a little more favorable status in the Persian Empire. That king, Xerxes, dies, and his son Artaxerxes takes over in 465 BC. And we see again at this point in the second half of the book of Ezra that there's a religious revival that occurs in here somewhere. And then a little bit later on, political and military threats from rival people groups out by Jerusalem come to the attention of the king's Jewish cupbearer, Nehemiah. And Nehemiah's like, I gotta go fix this stuff. And the king's like, you know what, I like you. Go for it. Go fix it. Here's some money and my blessing. And Nehemiah goes and fixes it in record time, gets the walls rebuilt. But then that isn't the end of the story, because even though the walls are rebuilt and the temple's rebuilt, there's still a people who need to be rebuilt. This is where the timeline conundrum of what we've been looking at comes in. And over the last couple hundred years, there's been a bit of debate about this. I thought today seemed like as good a day as any to speak to that debate. The problem is this: it's the timeline of rebuilding the people. It looks like in the second half of Ezra, we get a religious revival that seems to deal with the problem of the Jewish people intermarrying and adopting the idolatry, or flirting with adopting the idolatry of the neighboring tribes. But then in the second half of Nehemiah, with what we're getting into here in Nehemiah 8, Nehemiah 9, and on to the end, it looks like there's another very similar revival that's going on here. And so especially in the late 1700s and a whole bunch in the 1800s and early 1900s, scholars looked at this and said, oh, there's a timeline discrepancy here between Ezra and Nehemiah. This shouldn't be read as one continual narrative through the book of Nehemiah. We're kind of jumping around, and the way it's written down, there must just be some mistakes in the timeline or something, because there wouldn't be two revivals like this. Now, this is the point in the conversation where we take a fork in the road with everybody who's listening. There are people here who would say, the Bible's accurate and reliable, and it keeps getting vindicated by history every time people ask questions of it or criticize it, and I bet it's going to turn out to be right here as well. Maybe I'm a little bit threatened by the people who are asking these questions. Then there are others of you who are listening who are like, look, I don't need every single detail to be exactly right. I suspect there might be some timeline issues here or there. That's not a deal breaker for me. Full disclosure, I'm a part of the prior camp. I think it's reliable. It keeps turning out to be reliable as I look at it. But also, I'm pretty secure in that, so I don't feel super threatened or weird when people ask perfectly reasonable questions about the Bible and how it holds together. If it is what it claims to be, probably ought to check out. So, it's like anything else. You just dig into it and find out what the heck is going on here. But this is a very important detail. The timeline questions about these two revivals, you'll recall, I mentioned that they got real hot in the 1800s. Well, what was going on in the 1800s? It would cause people to wonder about this timeline. Two things. Thing number one is there was a general air of skepticism, particularly in European scholarship about the Bible, particularly in terms of timeline and history. There was a type of historical criticism that the Bible was being subjected to, and whereas in centuries past, the starting assumption would have been it's reliable and accurate, in the 1800s, more the starting assumption was maybe there's some problems here with the timeline, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the Bible isn't entirely historically accurate. So the starting assumption shifted, and that lent itself to more of a willingness to criticize the text, criticize the timeline. That's the first thing that's going on in the 1800s. Second thing that's going on is a whole lot of discoveries surrounding Persia. People were becoming very interested in this age. This was a people group that went underground for millennia. People knew there was a Persia from Herodotus and a few other ancient historians, but we didn't have much of any of their stuff. And it was in the 1800s that Persia started to reemerge from the sands, and it captured people's attention. So it might be tempting for you and me to look at all that we know about Persia now and imagine that that's always been there and everybody's had the same stuff to look at, but that's not true. This stuff was coming out of the sand over the course of the 1800s and 1900s and even now. And so as people are writing, they weren't always writing with a particularly accurate version of the timeline. Remember, going all the way back to Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, there's been confusion about the big, important Achaemenid Persian kings and when they were in charge. Xerxes and Artaxerxes, we see for a couple thousand years, kept getting flip-flopped in people's brains, and they weren't exactly sure how to categorize that. Well, that confusion, which has now been entirely clarified thanks to archaeology and research, that confusion is part of what informed people saying, oh, there's a problem with the Bible here. Well, they just didn't have all the data. And so I don't think we're talking about malicious people who criticize this timeline. I think they were working off the data they had in front of them. And if you live in an era where it's not fashionable to give the benefit of the doubt to the reliability of the Bible, that's just what you're going to write. It's what you're going to do. So this whole controversy that I'm telling you about here, which is really not a controversy at all, when people bring it up, this is anachronistic. This is a controversy that was hot and kind of made sense given the data we had in front of us in the 1800s and first half of maybe the 1900s. It's not really very controversial now at all. What is clearly going on in Ezra and Nehemiah is two revivals or one long revival that is happening over the course of 15 or 20 years that gets real hot at two different points, and those two hot spots are what get highlighted in the text. So we go back here to Ezra. What are we at? Dang! We're at 12 minutes already. Okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to split this thing in half, and the next episode might be really, really short because, again, I don't think it's that hard to resolve, and I think we can do it with accuracy and names and dates right here in the text. And I further think this is important because if we are dealing with the same thing talked about twice, we should handle it differently than if we're dealing with one big revival with two separate hot spots, one recorded in Ezra, one recorded in Nehemiah. So with that in mind, I'm going to hit pause, and then we're going to finish this thing up tomorrow majestically and nobly, resolve a little bit of tension, and then charge forward into a very dramatic scene, a very dramatic prayer in Nehemiah chapter 9 that is going to set the tone for the rest of the book. All right, that's it. Pause point. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.